You know this date. You know the men who signed it. 6 women, 1 revolution. And history almost erased every single one of them. This is the story of the women the Founding Fathers forgot to mention. While John Adams sat in Philadelphia helping draft the future of a nation, his wife Abigail sat alone on their farm, raising 4 children, running a household, and reading every letter he sent with the hunger of someone locked outside a room where her own life was being decided. She picked up her pen. What she wrote that day would outlive every law passed in that room, and almost none of the men reading it took her seriously. "Remember the ladies," she told her husband. "Don't put unlimited power into the hands of husbands," she warned, because all men, given the chance, would become tyrants. It wasn't a request. It was a threat dressed in 18th century politeness. John Adams wrote back joking about her saucy tone, dismissing it as a tribe of women growing discontented. According to historians, he never seriously entertained the idea. Here's the human break in this story. Abigail didn't write back for over a month. When she finally did, she simply said she didn't feel like entertaining him, and that she didn't think he was being very generous to women at all. A woman who ran a farm, raised 4 children, and held her husband's political life together alone, had asked for one thing: to be remembered. The answer, even from a man who loved her, was a joke. She never held a gun. She never set foot on a battlefield. And some historians believe her words did more damage to British rule in Massachusetts than most muskets ever did. Mercy Otis Warren had no formal education. Almost no woman did at the time. What she had was access, a front-row seat to the men shaping the revolution, including her close friends John and Abigail Adams. So she picked a weapon nobody expected from a woman of her era: satire. Writing anonymously, she published biting political plays mocking Massachusetts' royal governor, turning him into a tyrant named Rapatio in front of the entire colony. Everyone in Boston knew who Rapatio really was. Everyone also suspected who was writing it, even though, as a woman, she couldn't put her name on it. Her brother, James Otis, one of the earliest voices for independence, suffered a mental breakdown that ended his political career. Warren stepped into the silence he left behind, continuing to push the cause of liberty in his place, through letters, plays, and eventually, history itself. In 1805, she published a 3-volume history of the American Revolution, one of the first ever written, and reportedly the first written by a woman who had lived through it. John Adams, the man she'd known for decades, was so furious about how she portrayed him in that history that he sent her 10 angry letters accusing her of writing bad history simply because she was a woman. They didn't speak for years. They eventually reconciled, but by then, history had already started forgetting her name in favor of his. According to a story passed down through one family for generations, a 16-year-old girl named Sybil Ludington rode through the night, alone, on horseback, through 40 miles of dangerous countryside, to warn American militiamen that British troops had burned the town of Danbury, Connecticut. She's been called the female Paul Revere ever since. There's just one problem. Many historians now believe she may never have made that ride at all. No diary entry, no militia record, no letter from Sybil herself ever mentions it. The story doesn't surface anywhere in writing until 1880, more than a century after it supposedly happened, when it was told by her own nephew, who was actively campaigning to get his family recognized as war heroes. The horse's name, the stick she allegedly used to knock on doors, the exact 40-mile distance. Researchers say much of it may have been added later, generation by generation, the way family stories tend to grow with retelling. And yet, the legend was powerful enough to earn her statues across the East Coast, a spot on a U.S. postage stamp, and an annual 50-kilometer race retracing her supposed route. So why does this matter? Because somewhere underneath the legend, there may be a real teenage girl. Her father had a bounty on his head from loyalist enemies. If she really did ride that night and word got out, it could have gotten her killed. Some historians argue that's exactly why there's no record. Silence may have been survival, not absence. We may never know if Sybil Ludington rode through the dark to save a militia. What we do know is that for 200 years, people needed her to have done it. Deborah Sampson grew up as an indentured servant, bound out to another family at age 10 after her own fell apart. By the time she was a young woman, she wanted something the law would never give her, the chance to fight for her country. So she became someone else. She cut off her hair, bound her chest, and walked into a Continental Army recruiting station as a man named Robert Shirtliff. It worked. She was tall for a woman, around 5'7", and she was placed into an elite light infantry unit, the kind reserved for soldiers who could march hard and fight harder. Nobody there was looking for a woman, because nobody believed a woman could meet the standard. For 17 months, Robert Shirtliff lived as a soldier. Sampson fought in real skirmishes against loyalist raiders near Tarrytown, New York. In one fight, she took a musket ball to the thigh. According to accounts of her service, she was terrified that a military doctor would discover her secret if she sought treatment, so she reportedly tried to treat the wound herself rather than risk exposure. She kept serving. Her secret finally came out the way most secrets do, not through battle, but through illness. A fever in Philadelphia in 1783 left her unconscious and in need of medical care. A doctor discovered the truth. Here's the part that should surprise you. Her commanding officer didn't punish her. General Patterson gave her an honorable discharge, some travel money, and let her go home quietly, at a time when other women caught doing the same thing were publicly humiliated. She spent years afterward fighting Massachusetts for the pension and back pay the Army had withheld from her simply because of her sex, and eventually won. She became the only woman in the Revolutionary War known to receive a full military pension for her own service, not her husband's. She didn't disappear into anonymity after the war. She put the uniform back on, stood in front of audiences, and told them exactly what she had done, even performing the soldier's drill with a musket on stage, as if to prove, one more time, that her body had actually done what her mouth was claiming. Think about that for a second. A woman who spent 17 months terrified that one wrong move would expose her, who dug a musket ball out of her own leg rather than risk a doctor's hands, later stood in front of strangers and asked them to look at her directly. At a time when women weren't supposed to speak in public at all, Deborah Sampson stood on a stage and made America listen. In the brutal heat of one of the Revolution's longest battles, soldiers were collapsing from heat stroke before the British even fired a shot. Survival on that battlefield depended on one thing: water. That's where the women came in. Camp wives carried buckets back and forth between the lines all day, soaking cannon sponges and keeping exhausted men alive. The men reportedly shouted the same two words every time they needed a refill: "Molly, pitcher!" Molly being a common nickname for any woman named Mary, and pitcher simply meaning the water she carried. According to the most repeated version of the story, one of those women, believed by many historians to be Mary Ludwig Hayes, watched her husband collapse at his cannon during the fighting. Rather than retreat, she reportedly stepped into his place and kept the gun firing. A soldier who claimed to witness it later wrote that a cannon shot passed directly between her legs without harming her, taking nothing but the bottom of her petticoat. Here's where the story gets complicated. Historians now largely agree that Molly Pitcher isn't one woman at all. She may be a blend of several real women who manned cannons or carried water that day, including Margaret Corbin, who was severely wounded taking her own husband's place at a different battle 2 years earlier. So, which woman was the real Molly Pitcher? Possibly none of them exactly. Possibly all of them. What's certain is that thousands of women followed this army through freezing winters and burning summers, doing the unglamorous work that let the soldiers survive, and almost none of their individual names made it into the history books. Molly Pitcher may be the only reason any of them are remembered at all. She was around 7 years old when she was taken from her family on the coast of West Africa, transported across the Atlantic, and sold into slavery in Boston. She didn't speak a word of English when she arrived. By the age of 14, she had written her first poem. By 20, she had done something almost no black person, enslaved or free, had ever been allowed to do in America. She had written the book good enough to be published. But here's the human breaking point of her entire story. Nobody would believe she'd written it herself. Before her book could be published, a panel of 18 prominent Boston men, judges, ministers, even the colonial governor, was assembled specifically to interrogate her and confirm that the poems were really hers. Not because her writing was weak, because the idea of a young enslaved woman producing work like this was, to them, almost impossible to accept. She passed. Her book was published in London in 1773, making her one of the first black women in history and the first in the American colonies to publish a book of poetry. She wrote directly to George Washington as he led the Continental Army, and according to multiple accounts, he was moved enough by the poem that he invited her to visit his headquarters. Here is the part most people never hear. Wheatley supported the revolution with everything she wrote. A war fought entirely in the name of freedom, while she herself remained enslaved for years of it, watching men celebrate liberty as an abstract idea while denying it to her as a daily reality. In her own letters, she compared American slaveholders to the pharaohs who once enslaved the Israelites, saying the same hunger for freedom lived in everyone, regardless of who was allowed to have it. She was eventually freed. She married. She kept writing, kept hoping for a second book that would never find enough support to be printed. The most celebrated black poet in colonial America, praised by Washington, read across 2 continents, died young, poor, and alone, with her husband in debtor's prison. Her last surviving child died the same day she did. To this day, no one knows exactly where she was laid to rest. Think about the distance between those 2 moments. A woman whose genius once required 18 signatures just to be believed, buried so quietly, so anonymously, that 2.5 centuries later, we still don't know where to stand if we wanted to say thank you. One warned the men writing the laws and was laughed at. One used satire because she wasn't allowed to use her own name. One may have ridden through the dark, or may have only become real because people needed her to be. One disguised herself just to be allowed to bleed for her country. One may be more legend than person, built from the forgotten labor of countless women whose names didn't survive. One had to prove, in writing, signed by 18 men, that her own mind belonged to her. None of them are on the money. None of them have a national holiday. Most Americans can't name a single one. History chose to remember the men who signed the documents and quietly let go of the women who lived through everything those documents promised and so often failed to deliver.
So this 4th of July, when the fireworks go up and the flags come out, maybe it's worth remembering that the revolution wasn't carried by signatures alone. It was carried by women who rode into danger, picked up pens nobody wanted them to hold, bled in uniforms not meant for them, and wrote poetry that outlived the empire that enslaved them.